Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting for Wednesday, February 20th. First of all, would like to acknowledge that we are on the Coast Salish territories. And we have approval of the agenda with a new business item one is liquor license. So, Director Morrison?
I'd like to add a closed session, new business item, potential litigation, please.
Is that the same thought? I have one in closed business, section
Oh,
one,
okay,
subsection G.
Oh, probably, yes.
Okay, so with that new business item as well, so number 90, section 1, subsection G, it's been moved. Second, any discussion? All in favor? Motion's carried. Moving now to the adoption of the minutes for the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of February 6, 2019. Moved. Second, any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Is there any business arising from the minutes?
Madam Chair, I'm not aware of any.
Thank you. Now we move to the public input period. So is there any questions? Purpose of the public input is to provide the public with an opportunity to comment on an agenda item before us. Welcome, Mr. Evans.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair.
Good afternoon.
Madam Chair, on the agenda is on R2 is a bylaw to establish a board of variance. And this is very interesting. The public hopes that we would have some interesting discussion on this, perhaps the history of the old board of variance and some of the advantages and disadvantages of having it. For instance, I noticed that a decision by the Board of Variance is final except where an appeal is provided in Section 544-3 of the Local Government Act. The applicant on the local government may appeal a decision of the Board of Variance under subsection of the Supreme Court. This is really getting into it. And Madam Chair, other discussion that might take place would be under 5368 of the Local Government Act. It states that a local government must provide in its annual budget for the necessary funds to pay the costs of the Board of Variance. So that would be interesting to hear some discussion on that.
That's great.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Could you turn, oh, thank you. You've got it down, Mr. Evans. Okay, we're moving on now to delegations, which we don't have. We're moving to correspondence, so C1. Do I turn it over to you, Mr. Tippett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The recommendation concerning a Cobble Hill grant need request is that it be recommended to the board that grant need, Area C, Cobble Hill, in the amount of $500 be provided to Mill Bay and District Conservation Society to support the operation and maintenance of the Coho Salmon Enhancement Project within the Shawnigan watershed.
Been moved. Is there a seconder? It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on to C2, grant and aid request, Electoral Area C, Young Seniors Action Group Society.
Madam Chair, the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that a grant in aid, Electoral Area C, Cobble Hill, in the amount of $500 be provided to Young Seniors Action Group to support the purchase of a sewing machine for the Quilters Group.
Moved. Is there a seconder? And discussion? Director Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Basically, just a quick explanation. This group provides some very high-quality quilts to babies, to seniors, to everybody. Everything is provided free to these people, and this machine is actually very large to enable them to make the bigger ones, and they don't have to keep carrying things around with them. So, to me, it's a very worthy cause.
Awesome. Great. Going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. And now we go to C3, grant and aid request, Electoral Area D, Cowichan Bay for YSAG. Kind of like that part. Mr. Tippett.
Madam Chair, the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that a grant and aid, Electoral Area D, Cowichan Bay, in the amount of $200 be provided to Young Seniors Action Group Society for the purchase of a sewing machine for the Quilters Group.
It's been moved and seconded. Any more discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on now to C4, grant and aid request, Electoral Area D, Cowichan Bay, Saanich Inlet Protection Society.
Madam Chair, it's recommended to the board that a grant and aid Electoral Area D, Cowichan Bay, in the amount of $500 be provided to Saanich Inlet Protection Society to support the March 14th, 2019 roundtable meeting at Brentwood College.
So looking for a mover. It's been moved. Is there a seconder? It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on now to information. We have some information, Mr. Tippett.
Madam Chair, it's just the minutes of the Electoral Area F Advisory Planning Commission from January 31st of this year.
Any questions? This is for information. Seeing none, moving on now to reports. We have R1, and that's for you, Mr. Tippett.
Indeed it is, Madam Chair, and I'm not going to do a presentation because it's a pretty graphic, rich document that Linda Wiersma prepared for the year-end report. She should get all credit for this. I actually offered her the opportunity to present it, but she declined. However, she did all the work.
She afraid of us?
Yeah, well, I don't know.
Don't be afraid.
No, I wouldn't say that. But I would say she was maybe a bit modest. However, it's a very statistic-rich document. I didn't think there was any point in going through individual slides of every one of these pages, but suffice it to say that the development trend generally is upwards in terms of applications, especially development permits in the CVRD, and we've had a fairly robust economy as evidenced by building statistics as well. And that is continuing at the moment, and we expect 2019 to probably be as busy as 2018 was. But if there are any specific questions on any of these reports, I'll try to answer the
Right,
question.
thank you. This is for information, but are there any questions for Mr. Tippett? Seeing none, you did a very good job. There aren't any questions. We're moving on now to R2, and I'd like to call up Allison Garnett. Welcome, Allison. Board of Variance Establishment Bylaw Report.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just move through the slides here. So the Board of Variance is a board appointed by the CVRD board, and it has some unique decision authority that is independent of the CVRD board. Every local government that has a zoning bylaw must, as required by the Local Government Act, also have a Board of Variance. The staff report introduces a new Board of Variance establishment bylaw. There is an existing bylaw for the Board of Variance from 2003, and it was in need of review and update. So here we are. This slide lists the authority that is bestowed to the Board of Variance by the Local Government Act. So it's quite unique. A variance or exemption to a bylaw requirement is probably the primary one where we would see applications to the Board of Variance, and these are somewhat similar to what a development variance permit process would, our presentation would be to you to be approved ultimately by the CVRD board. And the second most common, I'd say, would be this point 2, exemption to a prohibition on a structural alteration or addition of a building with a non-conforming use. So this would be a type of application where let's take, for example, a commercial business on an agricultural piece of property. It's not a conforming use of the land in accordance with the zoning bylaw, but if it was established prior to the zoning being in place, you are not allowed to, or the owners will not be allowed to do a structural alteration to that building, but they can appeal to this Board of Variance and get permission to do a structural alteration to a building that contains a non-conforming use. So, and then there's the third point is exemption from early termination of a land use contract, and then appeal of a decision by a building inspector. These are quite sort of obtuse parts of the Local Government Act, so if you have questions, I can try to answer them, but perhaps I'll just move on from here. The Board of Variance Establishment Bylaw that is proposed basically is separated into 3 parts. There's a Board of Variance appointment process, the actual application process, and then the decision-making process, and that's all set out in the draft bylaw before you. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions for Ms. Garnett? Director Acton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious where this has come from, why we need to update this 2003 one, and how come we don't have it a copy of it? And also, what would be the implications of changing the bylaw?
Yes.
Yes, through you. It was this bylaw review was assigned to me from the general manager of the Land Use Services Department. And upon reviewing the 2003 bylaw, it clearly was in need of review and update. I have to admit it was a relatively straightforward task to research other local governments, to review the relevant legislation, and to update the bylaw. And so that's why it is before you now.
Director Acton, follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when you were reviewing it, were you reviewing it with regional districts or with municipalities? Because I know somebody on a Board of Variance in Sydney, and it sounds like it's more of a municipal tool than a regional tool, so curious.
Yes, it is perhaps more used in the municipal context. Under the Local Government Act, or in accordance with the Local Government Act, regional districts are required to have a Board of Variance. So we have to have a bylaw such as this in place in order to be compliant. But whether or not it's more well used in municipalities, I really cannot say.
Follow-up, Director Acton? Because, an update from 203 is pretty important here. Is there any other questions for Ms. Garnett? Director Salmon?
Thank you. So just to be clear, so there's a 2003 bylaw, and we're updating it, or is it a brand-new bylaw and something's happening to the old one?
Ms. Garnett?
Yes, with this bylaw, we would be basically replacing or repealing the previous bylaw from 2003.
Okay, so follow-up.
Yep, follow-up.
So
Director Salmon?
what have we done in the meantime? I noticed that we've never used the Board of Variance. Is there some reason that, other than it's required in the Act, that we're going to start using it now? Is that what we're thinking, or?
Ms. Garnett?
Well, I wouldn't say that we have not been using the Board of Variance. There have been Board of Variance applications certainly in the past. We don't use the Board of Variance frequently. They're sort of a unique authority that they have. Early termination of land use contracts just hasn't occurred here in my experience. The applications that we have considered in the past for the Board of Variance are often when they are buildings that have a non-conforming use and they want to do a structural alteration. So that has been in the past when we've convened the Board of Variance to make a decision on that type of application. My experience with this regional district is that applications for minor variances are funneled to this committee and to the CVRD board for a decision, rather than convening the Board of Variance. The Board of Variance in some municipalities is used on a regular basis. I think they meet maybe every 2 weeks, similar to what this committee would, and they review these requests for minor variances to something like height and setbacks and other aspects. That's just not how the Board of Variance has been used at the CVRD.
Follow-up, Director Salmon?
One more. I think, Mr. Tibby, you had a chart in your presentation about Board of Variance, and there was zero basically for years, if I'm not
Mr. Tippett?
mistaken.
Madam Chair, Director Sam is correct. We haven't, I think, had an application since 2012, and Ms. Garnett was our, what was your title in respect to Board of Variance? Secretary of the Board of Variance or whatever. She was basically the official who managed it, which is why Ross assigned her this task. So yes, it's relatively infrequent. If I may be allowed, Madam Chair, to sort of get a little bit more into this. The Board of Variance is required by law. It's also, by some elected officials, perceived as a potential competitor to decisions that this board can make. For example, people in many cases, if it doesn't involve extending a legal non-conforming use, for example, it's just a citing issue, can either apply to the Board of Variance, in which case they have to demonstrate a hardship and the board might approve it, or apply to this board or this committee and then the board for a development variance permit. And in the past, we've had some directors who don't like the idea of a Board of Variance because they're independent of the elected officials and they can make fairly serious decisions that can affect an area, and they're not sort of directly accountable to the public. They're accountable to the people who appointed them, which is the Board of Directors. So that's just me, my recollection of how some previous directors perceived it. That said, I mean, I think there are certain powers they have, which Ms. Garnett mentioned, which are key, which can actually provide a safety valve for matters that otherwise would be really vexing to this board. So if someone has a legal non-conforming use or building, and, you know, our answer is, sorry, you have to rezone. Well, the Board of Variance might be able to deal with some of these things. So actually, it can be quite useful. And thinking back to Mr. Evans and what he said about, he was asking about budget, I thought I'd try and address that. We have a general budget that would deal with the minor compensation that might be necessary for setting up meetings and paying mileage for people to attend these very infrequent Board of Variance meetings. So it would not involve any additional budget, if that's what Mr. Evans was wondering. And I guess that's it. I don't know if there's anything else anyone has a question about.
Okay.
Did it help, Director Salmon, your question?
Yeah,
your
I have
answer?
a bit more, but if there's others, I'll wait.
Okay, Director Marcotte?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Microphone, Director Salmon.
You
No,
scared
your
me.
mic, sorry, no, yours is on.
Thank you. My first question is that many years ago, the Board of Variance was incumbent with 3 people on that board. And I know that they've had some very huge impacts to residents in my area. We have very few things like this, but we've had some very serious ones where they can take the opposite of what we think is the right way to go. So I would be very cautious establishing that Board of Variance, because I think there are some hiccups in it from the past, and they certainly were hard to get over once. There was a lot of hard feelings in a close community that knows what everybody else is doing, and pretty soon it comes into a mess. So that's just my comments on it, and the number is definitely 3. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm turning now, oh, Director Wilson. Oh, okay, oh, I didn't see your hand. Director Nicholson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's interesting what Mr. Tippett said there about, and what Director Marcotte said about some of the decisions which are being made. If I understand this correctly, the Board of Variance members would be not members of this board. They would be external to this board.
Correct.
And I have some reservations about this if there are decisions which will be made. Now, a very quick question here. If they make a decision, there is obviously an appeal process, but can they not make a decision and pass it forward to the regional board for further consideration?
Mr. Tippett.
Madam Chair, in practice, I think that has happened once or twice. I'm just racking the memory banks here. I'm thinking of one application we had in Electoral Area F some years ago, and I can't remember which came first. It was about an overheight fence, and you remember that one? Anyway, I think they either applied to the Board of Variance first or applied for a development variance permit first and were rejected, and then used the other one as an appeal body, and I don't recall the outcome of that. Do you happen to remember, Alison?
I do, yeah. I believe they, if I may,
Yes.
that they applied for a development variance permit and were denied, and then appealed to the Board of Variance and were denied there as well. The Local Government Act is fairly clear in that there is no appeal to a Board of Variance decision on most of the matters that the Board of Variance can make decisions on. The exception is an appeal to the Supreme Court, and that is only for a matter that is appealing the determination of a building inspector on a specific determination of the percentage of a building that's been destroyed. So it's quite a narrow section of the Act that allows for an appeal beyond the Board of Variance. So it is essentially a
Tippett.
final decision.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Alison. Yeah, so from a practical point of view, when someone goes to the front counter and says, I want to build my house 6 meters from the front parcel line instead of 7.5, we will always say, apply for a development variance permit. First of all, the reason for that is not, it's just because the Board of Variance actually has to find that there's a hardship, which is not defined in the legislation. They manage to make their own definition up, I guess, on the fly of what hardship constitutes. But from staff's perspective, we don't want to put people into a process that is theoretically more restrictive than the elected officials rendering a decision on the same issue. So we always recommend that. It very rarely comes up. There are the occasions that we look at where people come in saying, I have a legal non-conforming building, I need to expand it because of whatever. We say, well, the only way to do that is, well, there's two ways. There's rezone or Board of Variance. And so I think in practice, notwithstanding the fact that every variance theoretically could go to the Board of Variance first, very, very few applications will come forward, and it might be to the tune of one or two every couple of years. But yes, my comments earlier were correct, and Director Marcotte's recollections are spot on too. There were, in some cases, very, let's say, liberal interpretations of what constituted hardship, but because it's not enshrined in legislation in a definition, that just happened. So we do have to have a Board of Variance. We probably should select the members of the Board of Variance very carefully, and then we have to let them go. But I don't think it'll be a very frequent type of application.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Tippett. Yeah, and I share the concerns of Director Marcotte that perhaps something which would have a significant impact on the neighbours or on that particular neighbourhood would go through to a Board of Variance. But if I understand this correctly, your department would act as the filter as to what would actually go to a development permit, Rosin, or what would go to a variance. Is that correct?
Mr. Tippett?
Madam Chair, yeah, maybe filter's not the right term, but we would steer people in the direction of applying to this board for a development variance permit in almost every case, unless there was some other factor that required a Board of Variance to be involved. And as I say, that's extremely rare. Now, in using this fence example that was containing a vicious dog, if they apply for a development variance permit at this board, and the answer is no, they do have the ability, although we're not advertising it widely, to appeal, if you like, to the Board of Variance. Although one wonders if the elected officials here say no to a variance request, how can another body which has the additional imposition of a hardship determination on such a decision, how likely are they to say yes? So we would always, if someone asked us about it following a no from a development variance permit at this table, we would say, yes, you could go to Board of Variance, but they're probably going to be even more strict. Nevertheless, they can apply if they wish. So that's a possible scenario, and it happened one time, and as Ms. Garnett mentioned, in that case, the Board of Variance upheld the decision of the elected officials, which was interesting.
Director Nicholson?
I can't find it, but I was really curious about what hardship was and that kind of thing. And somewhere I read a more complete description of what this is all about based on a government information pamphlet. And so my question is, and when I look just right now, I'm on the Nanaimo website, or the Regional District of Nanaimo website, and they describe what undue hardship is, and they talk a lot about this being more of a site-specific issue. It's not a personal hardship, it's related to the site that you have and minor variations that you might need in order to use the site effectively. So I guess from my perspective, it's up to us, is it, to clarify this? And I also read somewhere that it was not to undermine, it was not to give people another avenue if they didn't get approval through this board, that was specific in that recall. You weren't supposed to use it as an appeal mechanism. So I'm just wondering how much of this we can clarify in sort of documentation so that there's sort of more clarity for a Board of Variance to operate under, because otherwise they have all the discretion in the world, and if you can choose, if it's up to the applicant to choose whether they go to a Board of Variance or to this board, it just seems to me a little bit haywire.
You'd like to follow
So
up?
the question is, how specific, what kind of guidelines could, I think Nanaimo's done a relatively good job, and the other piece that I can't find right now is even better, so I'm just wondering Because then you have the opportunity, if you have a Board of Variance that isn't following it, you can replace them, so to speak. That's allowed, so.
Mr. Tippett?
Madam Chair, yes, that's a good question. First of all, I'm not obviously a lawyer, but I think that if we wrote up guidelines like the City of or Regional District of Nanaimo has concerning what constitutes hardship, ultimately, that might be helpful guidance, but I think it wouldn't bind the Board of Variance because their authority derives not from a bylaw or whatever, it derives from the legislation, and it doesn't define hardship. So, you know, that's the challenge. So what I think we should do here, when I presume this bylaw or some version of it is eventually adopted, and then we look to appointing people to the Board of Variance, once appointees are selected, we probably should bring some legal counsel in to give them some sort of training, which we didn't do in the past, to my knowledge, to explain to them exactly what, you know, a lawyer's perspective is on their job and how broadly or narrowly they should interpret the hardship provision, because it's frustratingly vague. And as you are noting, it could be abused if people were feeling too generous on the Board of Variance. We do need a bylaw. And I think we should probably take a little more care with the training of eventual appointees. And I should also add that they don't just go off and do their own thing. We have a person that I think historically we call the secretary to the Board of Variance here, which is a staff person who writes reports for them, gives them advice, you know, attends the meetings, assists them in dealing with the application. So they're not flying completely blind. They do have the benefit of staff presence at those Board of Variance hearings. So anyway, that would be my suggestion.
Follow-up?
Can I follow it?
Director Nicholson?
That's not a requirement, though, in the legislation. They can operate independently. It looks like to me. My question is, in the bylaw, draft bylaw, there is no, you don't speak at all to how people are selected?
Ms. Garnett?
Thank you. Yes, the bylaw, the proposed bylaw just says that they are appointed by the CVRD board.
Strikes me that we should have a little bit more, we should have some criteria around that, how the board ought to go about doing that.
Mr. Tippett?
Madam Chair, I think that point is well taken, and procedurally, we did an advertisement for Advisory Planning Commission volunteers earlier, well, I guess late last year. We probably could do something like that here and then have interviews where the elected officials interview maybe top candidates, 4 or 5, how we hope that we get some volunteers, and ask them questions, pointed questions around scenarios, you know, to get a sense of how they would likely act, you know, once they are appointed or if they are appointed. I mean, that's an option for sure. I don't know if that kind of detail needs to be specified in the bylaw itself, but it might be a good way to approach this appointment process, because if you don't, you know, if the people aren't known to the members of the committee or board, it's kind of hard to know whether you're making a good choice or not without a bit of an interview.
Director Smith?
Thank you. My understanding is that we've been elected for governance, and we've been elected by the voters in our areas. Replacing, all of a sudden dropping to a Board of Variance that has not had the representatives elected, and they do not represent their constituents at the table. I think that 9 of us sit at this table, and replacing us with our governance with 3, even though it's a local government act requirement to have this bylaw, it still brings into question if it removes the governance from this table to a table of 3 that have not been elected to make governance decisions, and we have been elected to make governance decisions. I do have a question, and it's if it goes to the board, from the Board of Variance, is it the whole board that votes on the decision, or is it just the electoral area directors?
Madam Chair, I
And
don't
Mr.
see,
Tippett.
I was looking for Joe Barry or Kathleen
Okay.
Harrison. My sense of it is because the matters the Board of Variance would be dealing with are electoral area planning documents, that it would only be the 9 directors around this table who would vote on that matter, but I can't say I'm 100% sure of that.
Director Smith?
I'm going to add one.
Okay, yeah, okay,
Just
just go
for-
ahead. Mr. Crothers, go ahead.
Sorry, for clarity
Sorry.
to Director
Yeah.
Smith's question. You were asking about the board voting on the recommendation from the Board of Variance, or just voting on this matter around the establishment of the bylaw? You're correct on the first. So the decision of the Board of Variance is their decision. It doesn't come back to this board to be voted on.
Yeah.
Their decision is final.
So you're saying it doesn't go to the CVRD board for final approval, like all of our other decisions? So it circumvents the board?
So, Madam Chair, the legislation is very clear on the powers of the Board of Variance. It's not discretionary on the part of local government. It's prescribed in the Local Government Act, unlike other committees and commissions who are advisory in nature, and their recommendations do come to the board, and you do vote on them. The Board of Variance is different. It is arm's length from the board, and its decisions are final.
Do you have a follow-up, Director Smith, or I move on to Director Acton and then Director Salmon? Follow-up? No? No follow-up? Director Acton?
I guess, so I think a lot of people share the same concern as me with how there's no accountability to this board and in their decision-making. I'm wondering, can we limit their, we can't change of what they're allowed to look at or what kinds of applications?
Mr. Crothers?
Madam Chair, as frustrating as this might be for the elected officials, it is legislation. You are required to have a Board of Variance bylaw and a Board of Variance. So some of the issues around accountability, those are certainly advocacy issues, potentially with the province around the legislation, but, short of establishing some criteria around who you might select, and I would suggest that doesn't go in your bylaw. I would suggest that would be a policy decision around how you would go about doing that. This really is not discretionary. I think what staff have presented to you today is a best practice, what we would determine to be a best practice Board of Variance bylaw. It's not really negotiable. There are some concerns about it. I would suggest that it's not something that's frequently used, and that in your term of office you may never see a Board of Variance application. I certainly haven't in my time here as a CAO. And so I think you essentially have no choice but to approve a bylaw. This is the one that's being presented to you at the time, but there's very little that we can do about the issues around accountability. It's a legislated issue.
Follow-up, Director Acton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, then my last request would be, I feel a little uneasy without having this 2003 bylaw in front of us. Like, what exactly are we changing? And what are we updating? What wording?
I could perhaps add to that.
Thank you, Ms. Garnett.
There's not a lot of substance that's been removed from the 2003 bylaw. It was more clarity provided around the Land Use Services Department's support for the process, basically. So making sure it was clear that staff would present reports, would convene the Board of Variance, would make sure that we follow the legislative requirements for public notice to adjacent property owners. So there was not, I wouldn't say a fundamental change, a lot of modernizing of language as well. But a lot of, like, the appointment procedures, for example, they're all set out in the Local Government Act. So we're basically just repeating those. So certainly the existing bylaw, I mean, it can be made available to you. But I sort of assure you that no substantial changes have been made. Just more enhancements, more clarity.
Follow-up, Director Acton? I can move on to Director Morrison.
I have one more question.
Okay, follow-up, well, finish the question.
So, as an applicant, do they get to, you said that staff will try and persuade them to go the route of the board. Can they choose to say, no, actually, I want this application to go to the Board of Variance? Can applicants demand
Ms.
that?
Garnett?
Yes, I would say that the applicants have the right to apply to the Board of Variance, where the Board of Variance has authority to make a decision. Again, it's just a small part of the decisions, the land use decisions that this committee and the CVRD Board make. It's just variances is really the overlapping jurisdiction. Otherwise, the Board of Variance has additional powers that this committee does not have. But the fact that we don't have a very active Board of Variance is in itself a bit of a deterrent because the timeline to convene, whereas this committee meets on a regular basis and there's more of a set process and almost case law of your decision-making as well.
Director Morrison,
Would ask you call the question.
I just have one more speaker and then I will. Director Salmon.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I share the concerns of others, and I think there's a big potential for problems out of this. I'm thinking of, just happens, I'm connected with Victoria. They've got a Gonzales proposal, long-standing contentious, and the Board of Variance has been a big issue there. So I am thinking two possible things. One, I'd really like to see the draft of the old bylaw and compare to the new and really think about that. And secondly, given that we've had for 6 years without really using, I mean, wouldn't hurt advocacy-wise to check with the province just to see, is there anything in the works on updating the Local Government Act? Or I'd like to double check on that, but certainly the first, to defer the decision on that today until we get a really careful look at the old bylaw and the new bylaw.
I have Mr. Batstone that would like to speak.
Not ready for prime time, sorry. Just a point of clarification, hearing some of the discussion about nervousness, or at least as I perceive it, about delegating decision-making authority. Ms. Garnett was almost there. I just want to point out the obvious you may have already been thinking about. We already do delegate land use decision-makings to general manager. So it's not unprecedented in that regard. Of course, the consequences of the types of applications are different, but we do have that, and of course the general manager's decisions through land use planning reports are bound by the guidelines of our OCPs and development permit areas. But I just want to point it out that not all decisions are made by ESC through a recommendation to the board. So this would be the third option.
Director Morrison?
I'll follow it.
Well, just go ahead.
So could I move that formally, that we defer
What are you deferring?
the decision on the committee until we've looked at the old bylaw and compared?
You're referring this recommendation, so a motion to refer until you've read the old bylaw.
Yes.
Is there a seconder for that? There's a seconder. It's been moved and seconded, so we'll speak to the referral motion. Director Morrison.
On the propriety of referral, I'm really concerned that that we would seek to impose our view as to the quality of the work product that's been put forward today. We have so many pressures in our land use department. I've been here 10 years, haven't once had a contrary Board of Variance decision come forward, and of the things that we could be focusing on, I'm really reluctant to send this back to staff for additional work and review when we have our professional staff putting a quality product before us for our consideration. Thank you.
Director Acton, to the motion, to the referral motion.
I support this motion, and I don't feel like staff need to do a lot of work. I would just like the opportunity to read that 2003, because I'm making a decision. It might be small, it might not be, and I don't have all that information here in front of me. That's just, it could go on the next one just to give us a chance to read the 2003 bylaw.
Director Nicholson, on the referral motion.
I agree. I think we should refer it and think about it.
Okay, I'm going to call the question on referral. All in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on now to, thank you, Ms. Garnett. Moving on now to R3. Invasive plant treatment practices on CVRD lands. I'd like to call up Keith Lawrence. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
This is for information. Does anybody have any questions on the invasive plants? You've seen your report. You've had a chance to read it. Are there any questions? Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I was kind of curious as to whether there had been a discussion in the past, and was there any policy about this, using herbicides and pesticides in the CVRD?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, there is no policy currently in place within the CVRD for invasive plants management as it relates to herbicides. To clarify, our role in environmental services in this situation was to gather information from the various divisions that do manage invasive plants on their properties. And then that included understanding if there was any herbicide use. And so each divisional unit that does manage that has the information in terms of the details of what areas are being treated and what they're treating it with.
Follow up, Director Nicholson?
Yeah, so I guess I have, I'm not, obviously I think we should limit our use of herbicides. And I think that if you were to go out and talk to the public, that they would certainly be surprised that we were using them in parks in particular. And so I'm just wondering, and I also am really conscious that we have a invasive species problem that is going to grow exponentially over the next few years with climate change. We're already seeing, significant ecosystem degradation by invasive species like knotweed. So I don't think we want to rule out the use of herbicides, but I think we need to be really careful, and I think we need to have specific protocols about it, because I think the public would expect that. And that's not what I see here, because I didn't know we were using herbicides in parks. It kind of surprised me, jarred me a bit. And so it's I would like to have some clarity on when a decision is made to use it, what the rationale is, and make sure that and it's being applied by someone who's trained and so forth. So I'm not sure where that takes me to, as far as what we can do here. I guess maybe I'm asking staff maybe to come back with something like that for discussion, or I don't know.
So are you this is for information. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, we're going to move on. Thank you very much, Keith. Director Nicholson.
Well, then maybe I should make a motion to request staff to come back with some policy and protocols on the use of herbicides on CVRD lands.
Okay. Just a second, Mr. Crothers?
So, Madam Chair, just for clarity, I think maybe what the committee might be, and this will be referred to the Community Services Committee, because our Parks and Trails Division now reports to the Community Services Committee. We have regional parks within that service. I think potentially what the director and the committee may be looking for is to start with is a report on our use of herbicides, the criteria that staff use to determine when herbicides are used, and our method of application and who is authorized. Based on that information, the committee may choose to recommend that some protocols or policies be developed, but I would suggest that you would base that on information on how it's currently managed. You might be very comfortable and confident in how our staff are managing it. So if that is suitable clarity, we can, I've made note of it, and we can certainly provide that report to the Community Services Committee.
Is that sufficient? Seeing heads nodding, that's great. So we'll move on now to the R4.
Madam,
Yes.
if we can get a resolution on that, I would
Oh,
like
a
to.
resolution,
Yeah,
okay,
please.
go ahead.
So
Do you have it?
if I can, yeah.
Yes,
Madam
go
Chair,
ahead.
that the committee is requesting that a report from staff outlining the criteria for use of herbicides in parks and application, use of and application of herbicides in parks.
Director Nicholson, you're moving that? Seconded by Director Salmon? I'll call the question, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on now to R4, Yubo Mead Creek Critical Location Streetlight Service Area Expansion Request.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Welcome, Mr. Dennison.
So we have a request by some homeowners for a street light on Yubo Road at the Sword Fern turnoff. Apparently it's quite dark and can be hazardous in the evening when they're trying to turn in, see where the road is. And so there's a sort of safety concern here, and it's been supported by the area director. We have, in Yubo, we actually have a street light service, a fairly high density of lights through the developed area of Yubo, but this is outside of that. So it would fall into the critical street lighting function, which we also have in Area I. However, we've added a few lights in the last few years. We don't have much money in the function, in the budget. The next time we're allowed our every 5 years increment, and the requisition limit isn't for another 3 years. So we either have to wait a couple years, or we go to an AAP to get assent, or we plan to install the streetlight and then use our operational reserves to carry us through for the remaining 2 years. And so what staff will do is bring that forward in the next budget process. You'll see that that we plan to use operational reserve to carry us through that period. There's not much else to do with operational reserve at a critical street lighting function. So that's how we'll address that problem. And otherwise, we do recommend that the additional street light be approved.
Okay, it's been moved. Second? It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving on now to R5, repeal request for services.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a housekeeping matter on the other side of the lake. Occasionally, property owners initiate a process to join a sewer or water service area. We go down the line a ways and prepare bylaws and whatnot, and then just as it's ready for final approval by the board, they back out and decide they're not going to proceed. Often because there's some fees that need to be paid or works that need to be done, and they don't want to do that, so they decide to not pursue it any further. We have one such property in Honeymoon Bay, which actually has 3 service areas. There's one of the actual utility itself, the water utility, and then we have 2 debt services as well that we prepared all the bylaws for and whatnot to bring this person in. And they've decided, since that the property was too small, they'd anticipated developing, but they decided, or determined the property is too small, so they've decided not to proceed. However, we would like to get this off the books so it's not hanging there forever and people wondering in the future why that's sitting there and, why it was never dealt with. So we just have recommendations here to formally not proceed with those bylaws.
It's been moved. Second? It's been moved and seconded. Are there any questions for staff? Director Smith and then Director Wilson.
One of the things I noticed in the staff report was a comment about consideration of a fee for requesting for inclusion and exclusion may be considered in order to recoup staff time costs for preparing these petitions, reports, and bylaws. Is that possible to recoup these funds?
Madam Chair, we're looking into that, and we think there's nothing to recoup now. The staff time is spent and there's no fee, so that's it for this one. But it is something we are looking at, especially when, there's quite a bit of work. It ends up being not just our staff and engineering, but it goes upstairs, it involves finance, admin staff and whatnot. And as that turns through, it takes a lot of time. And especially if it's just speculative on their part, they're kind of rolling the dice and, they get us doing all this work and then it turns out it wasn't really very much of a serious initiative to begin with. So we think that's a good idea and we're looking at how we can do that and we'd like to bring that forward in future.
That's great question. Director Wilson.
Director Smith kind of preempted me there. But basically, yeah, and we hear this all the time about staff time and the costs involved in there. There has to be some way, and if it is purely a roll of the dice speculative thing, there has to be right up the front they're saying, look, we will do this for you, it will cost this amount of time, are you prepared to put that money up? Not in the form of a permit or anything like that, but if you are looking into some form of compensation for that work, then I think that's a good idea, and that's the way it should move.
Thank you.
Great. Got to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we're up to R6. We'll have to, I'm seeing that the presenter for this report is not here, so we'll have to move this to our next meeting. Mr. Tippett, is that appropriate?
Yes, Madam Chair. Clay Reitzma gives his regrets. He was double booked by his staff at North Cowichan, and he wasn't able to make the meeting today, but you have sort of the hard copy of his presentation, and he would appear with the committee's permission at the next meeting on the 6th of March.
Okay, so we'll refer it to the 6th of March. Do we need a resolution to that fact, or just a, okay, great. Is there any unfinished business? I think so, seeing none. And now we'll move to new business 1, the Roadhouse Pub, and I'd like to call on Mr. McDonald. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The purpose of this report is to seek direction from the committee regarding a structural change application submitted by the Roadhouse Pub. The CRD has the opportunity to opt in or opt out to provide comment to the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch with regard to the structural change application of the Roadhouse Pub, which is located at 5325 Trans-Canada Highway. The structural change involved here was just a minor change to the bar. They extended the bar, and the Liquor Control Branch officer went into the bar and noticed that there had been some structural changes to it, so they've come back and asked them to apply for a new application. So this one is time sensitive, as they have actually threatened now to shut the bar down should they not get this in a timely manner. So the rest of the report is in front of you. If you look at the rear page, the attachment A, I think is on the very back page, it shows where existing bars, and that little extension going up is the little piece they added to it. They're not changing the number of patrons, and they already have a license existing. Thank you.
It's been moved. Is there a seconder? Been moved in second? Any second?
Mike read the
Moved and
resolution?
seconded. Would you like to read the recommendation, Mr. Tippett, please?
Madam Chair, the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that Cowichan Valley Regional District opt out of providing comment and leave complete reliance on the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch to manage and take full responsibility of this license for the Roadhouse Pub, licensee Mohan Nepal, located at 5325 Trans-Canada Highway, license number 133620.
Okay, call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you.
We'll move now to question period. So is there anyone from the gallery that wishes to speak? Oh, whoa, okay. So we will now move to a motion to go into closed, motion that the meeting be closed to the public in accordance with the Community Charter Part 4, Division 3, Section 90, subsections as noted in the accordance with each agenda item. Moved, second, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. 5-minute recess to close the doors. Thank you.